Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are putting away the textbooks, the high-level frameworks. We are not talking about what should be ethical. We are diving directly into the messy, complicated reality of financial advice.
That's right. We're moving past abstract concepts, utilitarianism, deontology, all that. Today's mission is really to dissect real-world situations, those pressure cooker moments, to understand the practical strategies financial advisors use when, commercial pressures, client expectations, and strict regulatory obligations all sort of slam into each other.
Okay. And our sources lay out 5 fascinating, often ambiguous scenarios. But before we tackle those, we need the bedrock, right? What are the core ethical principles that guide judgment when the rules themselves maybe aren't crystal clear?
Well, the professional world really relies on 4 key pillars: integrity, objectivity, professional competence, and confidentiality. And these aren't just like suggestions, they're genuine guides for judgment. When an advisor faces conflicting duties, say a duty to the client versus a duty to their firm, these pillars define the professional North Star. They demand a consistent application of moral reasoning.
And the sources seem very clear that the challenge here is immense. It's not just about ticking boxes on a compliance checklist. It demands technical know-how, plus empathy, integrity, and, frankly, a bit of courage.
Yeah, definitely. And what's fascinating here is defining that fundamental tension. The vast majority of ethical conflicts really center on a kind of tightrope walk. On one side, you've got the professional duty of care always acting in the client's best financial interest. On the other side, you have the need to respect client autonomy, letting them make their own choices. And you've got that internal pressure to meet business targets. The ethical advisor lives right there in the middle of that friction.
That friction is exactly what makes these next scenarios so compelling. So let's jump into the first major conflict. Suitability versus client preference. We could maybe call this one the advisor versus the hot stock tip.
Yeah, a very common scenario. You have a client who is enthusiastic, maybe they've been influenced by social media or a friend, and they insist on sinking capital into some high-risk, volatile venture. Yet their documented risk profile clearly states low tolerance, and maybe their financial knowledge is, limited.
Okay, so the advisor fully discloses the risk, the client signs off, and the money goes in. Doesn't client autonomy ultimately win there? I mean, if the client insists, where exactly does the advisor's duty of care override the client's legal right to make a potentially bad decision?
Well, that's the essential test of integrity, isn't it? The ethical action is to recognize that documentation alone isn't enough if the advisor knows the decision could cause foreseeable harm. The advisor has to elevate the booty of care. This means really aggressive education, making sure the client understands the catastrophic potential, not just the upside. If the advisor truly believes the advice is unsuitable, that it contradicts their professional assessment of long-term well-being, they need to document their opposition and refuse to facilitate that specific action. Short-term validation gets sacrificed for long-term client protection.
That requires significant courage, especially in a client service industry. Okay, let's move to a more subtle conflict. Personal relationships and boundaries. What happens when the advisor and the client become genuine, close friends?
Yeah. The professional boundary starts to blur, and that introduces the risk of compromising objectivity. We aren't necessarily talking about something illegal here, but more about the erosion of impartial judgment. You might subconsciously, shy away from giving tough advice to a friend or maybe share too much personal information.
You risk turning a financial decision into a personal favor, almost.
Exactly that. The ethical prescription is to strictly maintain professional distance. Advice must remain evidence-based, free from emotional involvement. It needs to be focused solely on data and the client's financial goals, not, keeping the friendship going smoothly. The moment you start thinking, I don't want to hurt my friend's feelings by telling them this stock is, junk, objectivity is lost.
Right. Speaking of internal struggles, let's pivot from client pressure to corporate pressure. That's scenario 3. Internal pressure and corporate targets. We know businesses run on sales, right? So what happens when firms pressure their advisors to push specific in-house products or hit aggressive sales quotas that might not perfectly align with every client's actual need?
This is perhaps one of the most dangerous ethical dilemmas because it directly pits the advisor's paycheck against their client's best interest. Ethical advisors have to invoke their commitment to integrity and resist. And this isn't just saying no. This could mean risking performance bonuses or potentially even their job.
I wonder, though, how realistic is it for, say, a junior advisor to push back using internal regulations against a manager who holds the keys to their bonus? Does the system actually protect them?
Crucially, yes, it's designed to. Our sources highlight that the regulatory environment, specifically the FCA's conduct rules and the senior managers and certification regime, SMNCR, provides a kind of shield. SMNCR doesn't just look at the firm, it places personal, demonstrable accountability squarely on senior leaders for compliance failures. It essentially makes it very difficult for the boss to just say, "Oh, I didn't know."
So if a manager pressures an advisor to sell product X, regardless of whether it fits the client, and the advisor documents that pressure, the regulation actually backs the advisor because senior staff have personal liability.
Precisely. The core insight here is that documenting concerns is an ethical imperative itself. If you feel pressured to breach your professional duty, you must document it, because the regulation places personal accountability above any commercial directive. This forces the firm, ideally, to structure its targets around client outcomes, not just raw sales volume.
That's a powerful lever for ethical compliance then. Okay, let's move on to something maybe simpler on the surface, but equally painful. Disclosure and transparency. What if an advisor realizes, after the fact, that a recommended product carries higher fees, or maybe hidden fees, than they initially disclosed?
There's really only one ethical path here: immediate and complete correction. They have to inform the client straight away, provide the correct figures, and explain the error. This is a pure test of integrity. It definitely risks a temporary loss of trust. The client might think, "Wait, did you try to hide this?" But the source material argues really strongly that short-term honesty, painful as it might be, is the only way to build stronger, long-term credibility. Concealment is, well, it's terminal for the advisory relationship.
It sounds like the ethical action is almost always the one that feels hardest in the moment.
It often is, yes. And that leads us quite nicely to the final scenario: dealing with vulnerable clients. This requires a significantly elevated duty of care because the client isn't operating from a position of, let's say, rational strength. We're talking about clients facing bereavement, perhaps severe illness, or sudden financial hardship.
Right. In those situations, they might be struggling to process information or make sound decisions. The normal procedures for informed consent just might not be robust enough.
Exactly. This requires extraordinary ethical sensitivity and a demonstration of professional competence that goes beyond just technical knowledge. The advisor must first recognize the source and the severity of the vulnerability. Then they need to adjust their communication, maybe slowing down the pace, using clearer language, providing extra written support, or even suggesting they bring a trusted family member or maybe a legal proxy to the meeting. The ethical action is to be protective, patient, and highly empathetic to ensure the client fully understands. The advisor's role really shifts from just being a guide to being a temporary steward in a way.
Okay, so we've just run through 5 really messy, high-stakes situations where just relying on gut feeling could lead to inconsistent or even damaging outcomes. And that's precisely why the source material introduces a structured 5-step framework to impose some consistency and logic on that potential emotional chaos.
That roadmap is absolutely vital for consistency and, critically, for regulatory accountability. It helps transform what might feel like a subjective moral choice into a documented, defensible process.
Let's walk through it quickly. How does an advisor actually apply this reasoning roadmap when they're facing one of those tough conflicts?
Okay, it starts with step 1. Identify the ethical issue. You need to articulate exactly what core principle or duty is being tested. Is it objectivity being compromised? Is competence failing to address vulnerability? You have to be precise.
And step 2, make sure you look outward, beyond just the immediate client-advisor interaction.
Exactly. Step 2, consider stakeholders. This moves the decision beyond just self-interest or even just the client's immediate wishes. Who is affected? Well, the client, obviously, but also the firm's reputation, maybe fellow professionals, the regulator. Understanding this whole spectrum of impact clarifies the magnitude of the decision.
Then you bring in the formal requirements, the rules.
That's step 3. Review the rules and regulations. What does the firm's code of conduct actually say? What about the FCA guidelines or professional standards? What do they explicitly command or forbid in this specific type of scenario? This provides the external sort of floor for the decision.
And step 4 is where the real analysis happens, right? Deciding which path is least damaging or most beneficial overall.
Step 4. Evaluate options. The advisor has to look at the full scope of potential actions, not just the easy ones, and really rigorously assess the short-term consequences versus the long-term impact of each course. What are the costs? What are the benefits for everyone involved?
Which leads us to the critical conclusion. Step 5.
Step 5. Make and justify your decision. You choose the action that best aligns with fairness, honesty, and client benefit. And then, this is probably the most important part, you document the reasoning. The quality of that documented reasoning behind the decision is what ultimately demonstrates ethical maturity and regulatory compliance. If you can clearly show why you chose the difficult path over the easy one, you're defensible.
That brings us towards the end of our dive today. It's really striking that for all these complex dilemmas, the solution is never about avoiding the tough conversation. It seems it's always about escalating the level of detail, the documentation, and crucially, the quality of the reasoning behind the decision. So, ethical practice in financial advice is fundamentally about application and accountability, guided by those 4 core principles we started with.
Absolutely. And this professional duty, it's never static. Maintaining these high standards requires ongoing, continuing professional development, CPD, because the financial landscape, the products, the challenges, like new types of client vulnerability or emerging tech, they constantly evolve. Organizations like the LIBF, that's the London Institute of Banking and Finance, and the FCA expect this lifelong learning commitment. It's a foundational sign of professionalism.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, it seems clear that ethics and practice is about much more than just avoiding wrongdoing or, regulatory penalties.
Oh, definitely. It's the engine of trust. When advisors consistently act ethically, they strengthen the entire profession's reputation. They ensure clients feel confident that their interests really are paramount. Financial advice is, at its heart, about responsibility, stewardship, and the profound human impact of financial security.
That really is the essential takeaway, isn't it? Upholding ethical standards means actively striving to do what is right, even when it is difficult, commercially inconvenient, maybe requires challenging both your clients and sometimes your managers. So here's the thoughts for you listening. How might understanding this structured 5-step ethical reasoning process change how you evaluate advice or conduct, not just in finance, but maybe in any professional setting where duty clashes with convenience? That's your challenge. Until next time on The Deep Dive.